Hi! In this lecture, our goal was to understand Scrum, which is one of the most popular agile frameworks out there. We revisited the concept of waterfall, how we could improve it by means of iterative and incremental development. Then we saw the Agile Manifesto, and finally Scrum. And Scrum is a framework, meaning it doesn't tell you exactly how to do all the steps. It gives you high-level ideas on what to do, but the implementation depends on you. And this makes a lot of sense because each company, each team will have they have differences, and then this means you have to coin the process according to what makes sense to you. According to the two authors of Scrum, Scrum is a framework for developing and sustaining complex products. It is an empirical process, which means we try to learn a lot from what we do. It is lightweight, very simple to understand. You're going to see that we just have to understand a few time boxes and a few roles, and that's it. But it is very difficult to master, meaning doing Scrum properly can be tricky. My suggestion for you is to read the Scrum Guide. It really describes how the Scrum works. They quite update this guide very often. My discussion in here is based on the 2016 edition. You may try to read the most recent one, but the differences are usually quite small. So regardless of the version you read, this won't affect you, at least for the exam. We discussed this already. Scrum is quite popular. I show lots of surveys to you showing that this is popular. And then we go to Scrum. And Scrum, from a high-level perspective, looks like this. We have some planning at the beginning. Then we have a sprint, a cycle where we develop our product. We try to synchronize every day using the daily Scrum. Then we have some review focused on getting feedback from about what we did. And then some retrospective, which is about learning from ourselves and improve it. It is an iterative process. You can see we're going to do just a little bit of planning, we're going to implement it, feedback, and then we repeat. And it is incremental because hopefully at the end of the sprint we have something that is potentially shippable. So meaning at the end of a sprint we may deploy our software to the users so that they can start playing with the new features. What we need to learn are the time boxes. So the planning, the daily Scrum, the review, the retrospective, and the roles. Scrum suggests three roles: the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the development team. And the sprint is how Scrum calls its cycles. The suggestion is for it to be short, so from 2 to 4 weeks. And at the end of the sprint, you produce something that you can ship to your final users. And we then had a discussion of how should I choose the size of my cycle, my sprint. And we discussed the pros and cons. If you have a very small cycle, for example, 1 week, this means every week we're going to deliver something, right? We're going to deliver very fast, and this means we can also adapt very fast because we're going to plan for the next 5 days. And if we need to change something, we can change something after 5 days because we're going to do a new planning, and then we can change our directions, right? So a small cycle means lots of adaptation, lots of flexibility, but it also means that you deliver less, right? Because, well, what can you do in 1 week? Maybe not as much as you can do in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. On the other hand, if you go for a very big cycle, 4 weeks, for example, you can produce a lot. So at the end, you're going to have a very good, strong features to deliver, but it reduces your ability to adapt because as soon as you leave the planning, meaning you decided what to do in this sprint, we try not to change so that developers have at least a small amount of safety. But maybe 1 month is just too big, and some business they need to change very often, and then the 4 weeks sprint might not work for you. So this was our discussion. Then we went to the first time box, which is the sprint planning. And the goal of the sprint planning is to plan what we're going to do in that sprint. Yeah, so not what we're going to do for the next 1 year of the project, but what we're going to do for the next sprint, the next 2 weeks, for example. And it starts by the product owner presenting the most important item of the backlog. And the backlog is this list of items. And the difference between a backlog and just a list is that the backlog is prioritized. So the feature at the top of the backlog is the most important one. The feature at the bottom of the backlog is the least important one. So this is a prioritized list. And the PO gets the first one, the most important one. It presents to the team discusses and estimates the effort. And this discussion can be very technical, so the team can discuss about how they're going to implement it. And if they have questions, they ask the PO right away. So, and this discussion is actually very important because it will clarify things, and the team will be then able to estimate. Can we do this in this sprint? Yes, we can. Can we do more? Yes, we can. Then we just repeat, and the PO presents the next item. We discuss the next item again as a team, and we repeat it. And please note that the team is the one responsible to estimate the effort, which can be quite different from more traditional approaches where your manager estimates how long something is going to take and just tells you, well, you have 8 hours to implement this feature. This is the other way around. The team estimates. At the end of this sprint planning meeting, you're going to have what we call the sprint backlog, which is basically the list of items you're going to do in this sprint. But how to estimate how much it fits in a cycle, in a sprint? There are lots of ways to do this. Experience is definitely one of them. So you're an experienced developer. You've been working in this software for a while, so you know how it works. And your experience can guide you when deciding, well, this is what we can do in this sprint and nothing more, or maybe we can do something else. Empirical data, we can look to your past data and see, for example, that whenever we work in the invoice part of the software, it takes a little bit more. You have data, right? Why not use it? Or planning poker, which is basically a consensus-based technique. And we discussed planning poker, and the ideal is that the entire team is there and they're going to discuss and they're going to come up with a consensus about how hard this feature is or how complex this feature is. And how we do is each developer individually thinks about an estimation, then they show it to their peers, and then they discuss about the numbers they find. And usually the traditional way to do this is we just ask the person with the highest number to say something and the person with the lowest number to say something, because maybe the person with the highest number found something very complicated, a problem, and the person with the smallest number maybe saw an easy way to implement it. And people discuss until they got to a consensus, right? So in this slide I give you how to do it. In terms of numbers, what number should I show when I'm doing this estimation? Should it be hours? Should it be days? It's more up to you. It can be whatever unit you want, but some teams prefer to do story points, and story points are they don't have a dimension. They just make sense for the team. So this story is 2 points, and this other story is 5 points. So this means that 5 is like 2.5 times bigger than 2. So this is how you can compare things. Another suggestion, another pragmatic suggestion actually, is to use not a linear scale, because at the end of the day, what's the difference between 5 hours and 6 hours when it comes to estimation? But choose something that grows faster, for example, Fibonacci scale, so that you as a developer, you have to really decide if this is 5 or 8 and 13, and you can see that the difference between an 8 and a 13 is quite big, right? Almost the double. So it just helps you, it tries to reduce the natural bias we have when estimating things. Some things, teams also like to, as soon as they have a user story and they discuss, they like to break those stories into small technical tasks. User stories are usually very focused on the business and not very technical, but some teams find useful to then write it down, the technical tasks they have to do to implement the feature. For example, we need to configure a database. We need to implement the user interface in this way. The PO is often not involved in these technical tasks. POs, they don't have to be technical at all, but some teams like to do it, right? Then as soon as you have it, we go to the development time, and this means let's build the feature. Then developers, they basically go feature by feature and they develop. They make use of Kanban, for example, and Kanban is something that helps them to visualize how their progress is going. And what they basically do is, well, they get the most important feature. They usually start from this feature. They do it. When they are done, they just start the second one. Of course, if you have many developers in your team, you can start more than one feature at the same time. In the Lean lecture, we discussed if this makes sense or not. But right now, this is what we do. We just want to visualize how our progress is going. And you can decide your workflow, right? So it doesn't have to be as simple as to do, doing, and done, but you can try to break it up. So if you decide that you need to do testing, at all user stories, maybe you can have testing as a phase in your Kanban, right? Every day, the teams, the members of the teams, they try to do the daily Scrum, which is mostly for them to synchronize and find problems. And it's usually about developers getting together and then they basically discuss, yesterday I worked on this, today I'm going to work on that, and I have no problems right now. This is really nice because you're always getting together and you always know how your sprint is going. This makes a lot of sense because something I didn't discuss in the sprint planning, but this is also an important part, is at the end of the meeting, the developers, they usually come up with a goal. So a goal from the business perspective. So the goal of this sprint is to deliver ideal payment in our web store. And developers, they commit to this goal, and this is what they need to deliver at the end of the sprint. And by doing daily Scrum, meeting every day, they can see whether they are going to achieve the goal or if they will have problems. And this means calling the PO and talk to the PO and see what they can do, right? So this is more for the team to synchronize and to raise problems as soon as possible. Then we went to the sprint review, and the sprint review is focused on getting real feedback from the software we built. So we just spent 1-2 weeks building something. Our PO is, of course, checking it, experimenting it, but then when we go to the sprint review is where we want to get some real feedback. Lots of companies, they do their sprint reviews even with their final user. So they bring the user to the team and they say to the user, these are the features we implemented, play with it. Is it what you want? So this meeting is there for us to get feedback, for us to then learn from what we did and, for example, write more user stories if the PO or the user feels that the feature is not complete. And, well, this is what we want, right? So we want to adapt, and as soon as the person sees what we did, there will be improvement points. So you can feed the backlog in this meeting. And this is also the meeting where we decide whether to ship or not the current version. Maybe the PO is really happy and the PO says, well, let's put this version in production right now. Or maybe, well, cool, what you delivered is cool, but still not enough for us to deliver to the final user. Let's wait another sprint to deploy. How do we know that something is done? And then we had this discussion. Scrum has this definition of done, and this means your team needs to define what done means. And because we just want to deliver stories that are completely done, right? We don't like partial work. It doesn't make sense. Going back to this means that you need to come up with a criteria, and the criteria can be something as our user stories are done as soon as we implemented them, as soon as we did some system tests, and as soon as we deploy it to the staging environment. It is just a set of criteria that you have that will tell you whether something is done or not, right? If you're doing user stories, maybe your acceptance criteria can be part of the definition of done. We implemented the feature and it passes all the criteria, all the acceptance criteria. Yeah, so come up with a definition of done and just only deliver stories that are completely done. Then we go for the retrospective, and the goal of the retrospective is to see what we did, reflect about our behavior, and then improve it. And we do this by getting people together, so all the developers, PO, Scrum Master, everyone together, and we just sit and discuss what we did well, and these are things that we want to keep, right, because we're doing it well, and what can be done better, so what can we improve. And what we usually try to do is, on things that we need to improve, we try to come up with actionable points. So things that we will really implement in the next sprint that will make things better. It is usually the time that we try to see if the improvement points from the last retrospective, they worked or not, right? Because you raise the problem, you try to improve it, did it work? If it worked, you decide whether to keep this action point or to change it because it didn't work and we still have the problem, right? So revisiting problems and thinking about how to improve is what the sprint retrospective is about. There are different techniques. The one that I told you was about the simple one. You just put post-its in a wall, positive points, negative points. Then as soon as everyone posted their post-its, a moderator then conducts the meeting. It discusses the positive points. It discusses then the negative points. It tries to find, together with everyone, actionable points. So this is what we saw from about Scrum. And as soon as the retrospective is done, we then just start the next sprint, right? And then we plan again, we implement, we review, we improve, and we repeat. So this is what Scrum looks like. Now the roles we discussed in a bit of an informal way. Let's see what they really do. So the product owner is the person that is responsible to maintain the backlog. So the PO is the one making sure that things are prioritized all the time, that stories make sense, that stories are clear enough. And the PO does this by having this strong communication with the final user. There's a strong communication with the development team, so this person acts as a bridge between the development team and the final user. The Scrum Master is focused on educating the teams on the process. So being agile is not that simple. Maybe you need some coaching on this. And this is what the Scrum Master tries to do, educate the team on the process. So facilitate the process. The Scrum Master is also responsible for removing impediments. If something really bad is happening, the Scrum Master can be the one responsible to work on removing the impediment. He doesn't have to be himself or herself in person to do it, but he or she is the person responsible to find a solution, right, and work on the solution. The development team at lastly is responsible for developing the product, estimating, raise impediments, problems that happen, and reflect and adapt. So these three different roles together, working to build software. So these are the time boxes we discussed. You have to have in mind first the whole idea behind it, why Scrum suggests you to do this, and then how to implement it in practice. So the two perspectives, right? The conceptual and then a way to implement it. Common mistakes when people are implementing Scrum. The team chooses an out-of-the-box process, but they don't understand why they are doing. So they do sprint planning, they do daily Scrum, but they don't know why they are doing it. They're just doing this because they read it in a book. You have to understand the value behind it, right? Everyone that is involved in the development, they need to know how the process works. It has to be very clear to everyone. If you just try to put Scrum and then you don't explain how it works to everybody, to your final user, to your PO, to your management, maybe to the upper level management, maybe it's not going to work. It's be very hard. You believe documentation is useless, so a lot of people, they just go agile and they think that this is an excuse not to document things. This is not true. We discussed this in the requirements lecture already. You do not incorporate some important technical practices. Again, we're discussing a lot about management, but you have to make sure that the technical practices, they need to be there somewhere, right? So testing is very important in software development. So testing needs to be somewhere in your process. And finally, you call yourself agile, but you're not embracing changes, right? So I'm agile, but please just ask me to change something every 6 months. This is not what agile is about. Some things for you to research, and this was the lecture on Scrum. See you in the next video.